Over the past few decades, we've seen video games evolve from basic gameplay loops to intricate mechanical and story-driven art. Yet some prominent game studios still fail to capture and hold player interest. What separates great studios from the bad? Well, unfortunately, it isn't just one thing. But today, I want to discuss what I have identified to be one of the main contributing factors, and that is the concept of iterative game design. To start, we need to understand what iterative game design is. Iteration is a concept of creating the foundation of something and slowly making improvements over time, with a final destination in mind. Yes, this can vary, because individual needs change over time, ideas appear, and the end destination can change. But the general guidelines should stay the same. An excellent example of this is the car. Created originally as a replacement for the horse and buggy, the end destination of a car was to provide more convenient and faster mode of transportation. Iterations of the car have been made over the last 150 years or so. With larger engines and more robust and spacious cabins, cars quickly iterated into being a large improvement on the horse and buggy. However, not all iterations have been solely focused on the capability of cars in transporting people. Some improvements, like the airbags, were designed to keep passengers safe. And more recently, we've seen a focus on improving fuel efficiency. Over the last 50 years or so, the overall design and functionality of cars have not changed that much. Instead, a focus has been placed on making vehicles safer and more enjoyable to own. The point I'm making here is that the direction of iterations can change based on the needs of the product. While cars were originally just a better way to transport people, they're now being iterated on in other ways. The same thing happens in game design. We saw the evolution of video games from things like Pong, Space Invaders, and Pac-Man, to Mario, Sonic, and the Final Fantasy games. Then came the first of the 3D games, and the modern controllers that we use today. This is the point where I see a shift happen. Much like cars shifting from capability to enjoyment and safety, this was when video games shifted from capability to what I think of as polish. The focus shifted away from how games worked into what they looked like, how they played, and what their story was. Before moving on, I want to discuss what is not considered iteration, to me at least. To explain, I will use The Last of Us as an example. Iteration is not the remaking of the same game with improved graphics. I don't believe that pure graphical improvements are considered an iteration. Additionally, I don't believe that sequels that do not change the way a game is played or a story is understood to be an iteration. If my memory served me correctly, The Last of Us 2 did not change the gameplay, it just continued the story that was built in the first game. For simplicity's sake, let's refer to these games as continuations rather than iterations. On the flip side, a great example of a sequel that's actually an iteration is Dark Souls 2. Not only did it change the narrative from Dark Souls 1, focusing instead on the undead curse rather than the cycles of the world, but it also introduced a variety of gameplay differences through healing, power stancing, losing health on death, and bonfire teleportation. Hopefully, that draws a line in the sand and clarifies my perspective on iteration versus continuation. To be clear, continuation style design is not a bad way to design games. Some of the best games in history have come in this form. The Last of Us is a fantastic game. So is the Halo franchise and the Mass Effect games. These games are largely continuation-based design. While they do make improvements on themselves, they don't massively change how the game plays or how the story is understood. And in these scenarios, each story is a continuation of the previous one. Iterative design, on the other hand, generally takes previous mechanics and story and changes how we understand or use them while being relevant to the previous iterations. In my opinion, this brings out the best creativity in designers. This might be controversial, but I believe that rampant creativity is inherently bad for game design. Creativity without a purpose leads to a game feeling disjointed. Think about how Call of Duty, which is supposed to be a military game, has skins like clowns, rabbits, Skeletor, Lilith from Diablo, etc. You get the point. That may be an extreme example, But when trying to build an immersive world, small details matter. And if a team is not aligned properly on the story and the world they are building, you can end up with characters and storylines that don't quite make sense. Iterating on an existing game or idea allows something I will call directed creativity. I'm sure the term exists already, so I'm not taking credit for it, but it perfectly describes the way creativity works when iterating on an existing idea. Utilizing this style of creativity ensures everyone understands the foundation they're building on, but also narrows the scope they're working with, which can lead to some amazing ideas. Trying to come up with something entirely new can be both difficult and intimidating, but trying to take something and make it better or different takes some weight off the designers and allows them to be more confident in the changes they're making. Aside from the emotional and mental savings you get from iteration, there are plenty of tangible savings as well. Creating a new story takes an immense amount of time and planning. The main plot needs to be interesting enough to capture attention, which is difficult enough on its own, but then each character, item, location, and line of dialogue needs to relate to each other and the main plot. Ideally, all of this should have some room for personal interpretation and perspective to give the player something to reflect on. All of this is incredibly difficult, and even more difficult to do consistently. There are also the in-game models that take a lot of time to create and design. These models also need to line up with the world and the story being crafted. All of these pieces need to come together for a game to feel complete. All of this costs money, and a lot of it. If a game studio is recrafting a story, models, art, and dialogue for every game they put out, it adds up quickly. This is why games like Elden Ring are so incredible. While the game itself is amazing, and feels fresh and new and interesting, it's largely a recreation of FromSoft's previous games. If I had to guess, I would guess that more than 60% of Elden Ring's models and world are reused assets, pulled from Dark Souls, Bloodborne, and Sekiro. They are then repurposed and adjusted to fit the world of Elden Ring, which gave them the tools they needed to create one of, if not the greatest game of all time. Which brings me to my next point, and one that Miyazaki, the president of From Software, and the game director of the Soulsborne games, talks about quite a bit, and that is the idea of building his perfect game. While there will never be a perfect game, there will always be a perfect game for each person. Iterative design allows for consistent progress towards the perfect game. There are a lot of caveats here, but I truly believe that no one will be able to make their perfect game on the first iteration. There are too many variables, too much time and money required to do it on the first attempt. This is why iteration is so important. As someone whose education and career is focused in business and marketing, this last point is huge for me. Iterative game design allows a studio to have a stable brand image and helps set player expectations. Before Dark Souls, From Software was primarily known for Armored Core, Tenchu, which was a samurai-based action game, and Kingsfield, which was a medieval-based action game. Today, they're also still known for Armored Core, but now they have Sekiro, which of course, very similar to Tenchu in style, and the Soulsborne games, which are, again, very similar to Kingsfield in style. This keeps them consistent with their players' expectations. Square Enix is another great example, as they've always been known for Final Fantasy, and while they do have games like Vision of Mana and Octopath Traveler, they all resemble these turn-based combat games, with the major exceptions being Final Fantasy XIV, 15, and 16. Again, they are consistent with what their players expect from them. This is because they both iterate on previous games in one way or another. Not to dog on them any further than they have been recently, but Ubisoft is basically the polar opposite of what you do as a business, as most of their recent releases have been the following: Star Wars Outlaws, X-Defiant, Avatar Frontiers of Pandora, Skull and Bones, Prince of Persia, The Crew Motorfest, Assassin's Creed Mirage, Just Dance, Riders Republic, and Mario Rabbids Spark of Hope. At this point, I think you see the difference between the previous examples and what we just demonstrated. Ubisoft releases anything and everything that they can, completely diluting their brand image and destroying any form of expectations from their players. You basically have to go back to the times of Assassin's Creed 1 and 2 to find any consistency, where they had Assassin's Creed, Far Cry, Rayman, and Ghost Recon as their main games. But by this point, you might be wondering why more studios wouldn't adopt this iterative design if it's so beneficial. Let's talk about that. While I personally believe that iterative design makes the best video games in the long run, it has its own drawbacks, and it isn't always the best way to make money in the short term. And if it isn't done well, it can dry up very quickly. First and foremost is that iterative design takes a lot of forward thinking and planning. As we spoke about before, the idea is to work towards a perfect game, or as close as you can get to one. This means that there needs to be a game in mind to begin with, which isn't always possible. If these creative paths aren't planned, then a game can quickly become stale if the iterations are not expansive or different enough on the previous. Gamers can be very judgmental when it comes to how games are created. If iterations on a game are not significant, then it's likely that studios will be labeled as lazy for reusing assets and working off the same story as before, which of course is a bad look. If done right, however, iterations on a game will build love for a series and foster incredible player loyalty and devotion to the franchise. This in itself opens the door to its own problems. One major vulnerability is that of complacency. When a studio continues to succeed, there's always the risk that they will come to see success as a guarantee rather than a result to be worked for. A prime example of this is World of Warcraft, who lost a massive portion of their player base following the release of 2 terrible expansions that focused on forcing players to be in-game rather than building a game that players wanted to be in. So far, we have mentioned a few games in this discussion, and I would like to highlight here some examples of good and bad iterative design, so we can understand what distinguishes these games and how iteration can be used in the future to improve the viability of higher quality games. Starting with the bad. To be clear, creating a robust iteration process that allows a game to be meaningfully improved in ways that players want takes a lot of time, effort, and creativity, which is why Assassin's Creed is the first on the list of games that I find to be a poor attempt at iterative design. To be clear, I don't believe this is solely down to the developers working on the game, as Ubisoft's management has always been set on a tight turnaround schedule for games, leaving the developers with very little time to listen to feedback and action improvements. The first Assassin's Creed was released on November 13th, 2007. Over the next 15 years, Ubisoft would pump out 14 main installments of Assassin's Creed and 17 spin-offs. Yeah, 17. Meaning that in 15 years, they made and delivered 31 games. I get that they are a massive organization, but based on this pace, games are being released before even collecting adequate player feedback for future games. Personally, I've always been most fond of Assassin's Creed 2, and I think that following Assassin's Creed 3, we started to see the downfall of the franchise. I would argue that Assassin's Creed 2 was a perfect example of what iterative design should be. They took the basic mechanics of the game and added a variety of tools that could be unlocked and used. They created the Assassin's Tombs, which offered creative and fun climbing puzzles to solve, and the story evolved significantly. Where Altair was the original Assassin's Creed protagonist, he was extremely reserved and quiet. Ezio, on the other hand, was this outgoing character who brought life to the game. Following the trilogy, the next games would lack creativity. The games felt copy and pasted from previous iterations with little to no changes made. In fact, the games got buggier as time went on. I still remember the graphical issues of Unity becoming memes, and the gameplay loop continued to be stagnant, with NPC follow quests, eavesdropping quests, stealth kill quests, and item retrieval quests. I'm sure there are some variations, but this still makes up the majority of the game. Assassin's Creed is still one of, if not Ubisoft's best-selling games, and people still love it. But over 15 years, there is a lot left to be desired, as the game has not evolved as much as it could have in this same time frame. On the other hand, we have Elden Ring, which is the culmination of all the gameplay and story trial and error of the Souls series, Bloodborne, and Sekiro combined into one. To be clear, the gameplay loop of Elden Ring is extremely similar to that of the previous games. Explore the world, become more powerful, defeat bosses, defeat the previous ruler of the world, and end the game. This is quite the oversimplification, but at the end of the day, that is the basis on which the game was created. The difference comes in how this gameplay loop is experienced. Surprisingly, much like Assassin's Creed 2, but on a much larger scale. Players are provided with a multitude of varying weapons to play in their desired way. In addition to this, the Ash of War system was implemented to allow for further customization and unique player builds. The story was expanded to create an in-depth discussion about morality, emotions, and religion. The majority of characters were complex, with varying desires and motivation. The world was opened up to allow for greater exploration, with catacombs, mining tunnels, and caves littered throughout to provide a sense of discovery and curiosity. The summoning system was expanded to make the game more accessible. Graces were more plentiful, with Stakes America aiding in making the game far more player-friendly, inevitably making a game greater than the sum of its parts. All of these changes were created from the discoveries of player behavior and their feedback over the past 10 years. The first Souls game was released in 2009 with Demon Souls. In a similar time frame to Assassin's Creed, FromSoft has released 6 soulsborne games, and they released 10 DLCs to accompany them. The reason why FromSoft is able to evolve their games so heavily between releases is that they take the time to identify the problem areas, compare it with player feedback, and then action it. But they aren't the only ones using this game design method. To diversify the conversation a little bit, let's talk about World of Warcraft and Final Fantasy. I know that over the past few years, this topic has been beaten to death in the MMO space, but it is a valid conversation. I'm not here to specifically say WoW bad, FF good, because they both have their issues, especially after Final Fantasy XIV's most recent expansion. But in terms of how they approach their game design and the tools that they have at their disposal, there is a significant divide between the two games. World of Warcraft is an MMORPG that was released in 2004 off the back of the great success of the Warcraft RTS game. Warcraft garnered fans with their unique characters, story, and engaging gameplay. At the time, MMOs were few and far between, and none offered the seamless world, community, and adventure that World of Warcraft provided. Not only was WoW loved unanimously by its players, but it provided the chance for players to be involved in a story that they came to love in Warcraft. The game continued to grow up until the sought-after release of Wrath of the Lich King, where we would get to see the result of Arthas's fall at the end of Warcraft 3. Little did Blizzard know that this would be the beginning of a great fall for World of Warcraft. WoW did not have much in the way of a main story. Instead, it had a bunch of side quests and lore that related to the events of the world and provided extra context to the characters and events introduced in Warcraft. All of this finally came to a head with Wrath of the Lich King. Up to this point, everything in WoW was an iteration of the Warcraft RTS games, placed in a populated, open 3D world. Once Wrath of the Lich King concluded, the designers needed to craft a path forward without relying on the events of previous games. This saw the release of Cataclysm, Myths of Pandaria, and Warlords of Draenor, each of which were tied to previous characters, but the story was new, with Warlords of Draenor being an alternative timeline to the one known by fans. Expansion after expansion, the player numbers fell until Legion, which again iterated on the story of the Warcraft RTS games. But at its end, it was another step towards completing the story of Warcraft. And following this, the game relied on new stories, and players began to fall away once again. The iteration of the Warcraft story is what had players fall in love with WoW. And once that was over, the designers failed to gain player interest. This failure is a perfect contrast to how the Final Fantasy series works. The 3 Warcraft games and their DLCs were all centered around one storyline, where the Final Fantasy games are generally individual stories with unique characters across each iteration. What this allows the Final Fantasy MMO to do is to access these pre-existing characters, worlds, and to reimagine their stories while keeping the characters roughly the same. Instead of having to completely design new stories from the ground up, they iterate on what has already been done, meaning that unlike World of Warcraft, there isn't a defined endpoint where players have completed the story that they were looking for. This keeps player interest in the long term and allows the design team to have the directed creativity we spoke about before, where they have a world and characters that they take inspiration from and build a narrative around them. By doing so, Final Fantasy XIV created one of the greatest stories in video game history, in my opinion. Subjective, of course, but if you haven't tried it, I highly recommend it. Over the course of 5 expansions, it built a world with inspirations from previous Final Fantasy games, but with a spin to make it unique in its own world. This brought success after success and led to a narrative that left nothing undone. It is a magnificent piece of art. It's funny though, because with Final Fantasy's most recent expansion, Dawntrail, we have actually seen a split in their design that diverges from what made the previous stories so great. I'll try to avoid any spoilers for people who have not played, but the first half focuses on building a brand new story with new characters and new locations not found in any previous Final Fantasy game. By all accounts, this part of the story was a relative flop. Yes, people liked it, but I think the mass consensus was that it was poorly done. I am one of those people. I feel they tried to rush when building this new narrative. Every other aspect of the game up to this point was referenced and drew on ideas from previous Final Fantasy games, meaning that they have established stories and ideas to build on, where this first half did not. It needed more time to bake and to explain and develop the world that we're living in. The second half of the expansion is basically the opposite. It pulls on characters, ideas, and a world previously used in other Final Fantasy games, going back to the roots of previous expansions. I see the first half as kind of an experiment which needs some fine-tuning. While the second half still has its issues, it is, in my opinion, a significant step up on the first half. To be clear, this is not to say everything should be an iteration. New characters, stories, and worlds are necessary, but they need to have time to be built and for the player to understand them. Had all of Dawntrail been about creating and understanding this new world and its characters, it would have been much more successful in garnering player interest, which is why I hope they spend more time on it moving forward. All of this is to say that good games take time, but being able to use previous work to inspire and expedite is always a good idea. It takes creative pressure off the designers, it allows players to have a better grasp of the game, and it helps aid the smooth transition into something new. With that said, it brings up the question again. Why don't more studios use iteration if it's so impactful? First off, with many studios recently, they don't have the ability to use it. If we look at some of the most successful recent games, quite a few are the first of their style to be released by a studio. However, sometimes it doesn't need to be a game iteration. 2 extremely popular and excellent games, Black Myth Wukong and Lies of P, are not iterations on games, but instead they're iterations on historic literature. And both of those drew from Souls-like game mechanics. The real problem is that iterating requires an understanding of what is being iterated on. We have seen the failure of a multitude of games that tried to iterate or mimic an existing game or piece of literature without understanding what made it good. I'm looking at you, Lords of the Fallen. More recently, we saw the massive flop of Concord, which attempted to replicate Overwatch without understanding why Overwatch was successful. Overwatch's characters were memorable, the game was easy to understand, and it was the first of its kind. Concord has none of these, and because of this, it flopped, costing Sony millions of dollars. It is a perfect example of why iteration is easier said than done, and has catastrophic consequences when done incorrectly. Time, passion, and understanding are key to what makes iterative design successful. Designers need to understand what makes a game or piece of literature great, and they need to have the passion and time to make thoughtful improvements. Smaller studios can struggle to implement iterative design because of their lack of resources, But why wouldn't established large-scale organizations use it? Well, because larger studios generally have shareholders to report to, and they're worried about things like quarterly earnings, product delivery, and efficiency. Iteration is incredible for the quality of games, but how does it stack up in terms of company success though? Surely releasing 31 games compared to 6 has to have been more profitable, right? Well, let's take a look. According to Assassin's Creed Wiki, the series as a whole has sold roughly 200 million copies as of September 2022. This does not include the most recent Assassin's Creed Mirage release, but from what I was able to find, it sold around 5 million copies in the first 6 months, so I doubt that number has changed dramatically. So, in total, somewhere around 205 million copies were sold for the whole franchise, which is a lot of copies. If we were to average this out over 31 games, it's roughly 6.6 million copies per game. Obviously, this is not a perfect metric, as some actually sold more and some sold much less, but this is just for comparison's sake. How does that stack up against the Soulsborne games then? Demon's Souls sold about 3.5 million copies across both the initial release and the remaster. The Dark Souls series as a whole sold roughly 35 million copies across 3 games. Sekiro reportedly sold roughly 10 million copies. Bloodborne, 7.5 million, which is massively hampered by the fact it was only released on PlayStation. And Elden Ring sold over 25 million copies for a total of 81 million copies sold, meaning that across the 6 games in the Soulsborne series that FromSoft has released, they average 13.5 million copies per release, more than double the average of Assassin's Creed series. On this metric alone, it seems that the greater average success is handed to FromSoft. But there's more nuance to the subject. Aside from the fact that FromSoft rarely discounts their games, unlike Ubisoft, there's also the topic of development expenses. I won't speculate on the costs to develop each of the games between both companies, but it's no secret that game development is expensive, and that FromSoft was able to achieve about half the success of Assassin's Creed with only 25% of their development output. In this comparison, the main benefit Ubisoft would have is a much more stable cash flow. Generally, having quarterly releases across all of their games, they would have money coming in more regularly than FromSoft. They would have money coming in far more regularly than FromSoft would, where they have large quantities of income, but far less often. By having to focus on quarterly earnings for shareholders, this makes iterative design much harder to sell to the executives at Ubisoft or any other AAA studio, especially when they still seem to be making quite a bit of money with their current development cycle. Only time will tell what will prove more successful in the future, but I hope that with the grand success FromSoft has been able to deliver with their iterative model, that we will see more game studios moving in this direction and delivering higher quality games. Iteration is a difficult yet beautiful way of creating games. It allows designers to really dig deep into their work and make something that they are passionate about. It allows players to help shape the games they love, and it creates games that can evolve and develop into beautiful pieces of art. Ever since the Dark Souls series, I have been in love with how the game evolved, and with Elden Ring, we got to see a decade of work culminate into the closest I can think of perfection in a video game. I look forward to the days where games can be more than just sequels or one-offs, where we can truly see the perfection of a designer's vision and enjoy the passion that they have put on display for us, the player. For now, we will have to wait and watch for what comes next, but I truly believe that we are entering a new golden age for games. I know this video was different from my previous Elden Ring theories, but I love speaking about games in general, and I hope you all do too. Having spoken about iterative design, I wanted to dive deeper into how it was used in the design and construction of Elden Ring in my next video. For now, thank you for watching, and I hope to see you then.